Okay, thank you all for joining. We're starting this week's Torah portion. It's actually a double portion, Tazria, Metzora. A lot of details that we really didn't come across yet in the last 2.5 books. So the first 2.5 books, and that is a lot of laws of purity and impurity, and specifically, most of the energy is given to the specific form of impurity, tsara'at, which could be translated as a skin leprosy, even though it's not a leprosy, but the Torah gets into a tremendous amount of detail, and some of this doesn't apply today because it's not common, and a lot of the laws of purity and impurity don't apply today in the same way. But that, nevertheless, the teachings are still relevant, and the lessons are still relevant, and the Torah is eternal. So even if it's not as practical as other parts of the Torah, we don't keep it in the same exact way because the circumstances are somewhat changed. We don't go to the temple. There is no temple, so we don't have to have ritual purity, but the message and the teaching is eternal. Okay, so that's the introduction, and now we'll do as we do, which is as our custom is, we'll share the parsha in a nutshell, and like I said, it's a double parsha in a nutshell, and we'll take a dive and hope for the best because that's what we do. We're a very hopeful group here. Okay, the name of the parsha, Tazria, means conceives, and is found in Leviticus chapter 12, verse 2. Because the beginning of the parsha is about the impurity that comes, some of the laws that come with giving birth. So it's Tazria, which means conceive, which is an interesting word because Tazria literally means to plant, but that's another story. The name of the parsha Metzora, the second parsha Metzora, is often translated as the leper, and is found in Leviticus 14:2. The Parsha of Tazria continues the discussion of laws of Tumah v'Tahara, ritual purity and impurity. It says continues because last week we actually started toward the end of the Parsha of last week. A woman giving birth should undergo a process of purification, meaning ritual purification, which includes immersion in a mikvah, a naturally gathered pool of water, and bringing offerings to the holy temple. All male infants are to be circumcised on the 8th day of life, which is we read about in the book of Genesis with the story of Abraham, and he circumcised himself and his son. But here it's a commandment for everybody. What we mentioned also in the second book, because the Torah says that someone who is uncircumcised should not eat the Pesach offering. So the people who left Egypt circumcised themselves when they ate the Pesach offering. So I guess this is already the third mention of circumcision. Okay, tsarat, often mistranslated as leprosy, is a supernatural plague which can afflict people as well as garments or homes. If white or pink patches appear on a person's skin, dark red or green in garments, a Kohen is summoned. Judging by various signs, such as an increase in size of the afflicted area after a 7-day quarantine, the Kohen pronounces it tameh impure or tahor pure. A person afflicted with tsarat must dwell alone outside the camp or city until he is healed. The afflicted area in the garment or home must be removed. If the tsarat recurs, the entire garment or home must be destroyed. This is basically the first portion, and then we get to the second portion, which is the purification of this tsarat. As outlined at the start of the portion of Metzora, when the Metzora leper heals, he or she is purified by the Kohen with special procedure involving 2 birds, spring water, and an earthen vessel, a piece of cedar wood, a scarlet thread, and a bundle of hyssop. Now, we can read that ceremony. It's very interesting, and what does it represent is also interesting. A lot to talk about. When a home is afflicted with tsarat, in a process lasting as long as 19 days, a Kohen determines if the house can be purified or whether it must be demolished. Ritual impurity is also engendered through a seminal or other discharge in a man, and menstruation or other discharge of blood in a woman, necessitating purification through immersion in a mikvah. So this is a deep dive into the discussions of purity, impurity, as mentioned specifically the tsarat, and tsarat of the skin, home, and garment. Maimonides, for example, that's what I said, it's not so relevant. Maimonides, for example, says that this concept of tsarat was unusual, a supernatural phenomenon, and does not happen anymore. But the beginning of the parsha, of course, woman giving birth, there is ramification in ritual purity as well. And in temple times, the woman would bring an offering. We could talk about that offering. So there's so many ways to go with this, and some of the specifics can be explained, and some of the big picture can be explained. So the only question I have is where to start from. So if anyone wants to direct me in a certain direction, good. If not, we will. I don't know. We'll start somewhere. We got to start somewhere. So if anyone's curious about anything specific, if not, we'll start maybe with some general points. Um, I guess the general point is what is the concept of purity and impurity? Even before that, maybe that's even already a specific concept. Even before that, we could talk about the placement of these portions. I'm going to talk about the portions of impurity and purity as this parsha, but also the beginning of last parsha, the second half of last parsha, because second half of last parsha talks about um, the purity of animals. In other words, what we refer to as kosher animals, the Torah refers to as ritually pure animals, right? So the animals, we talk about the kosher animals, and also we talk about there's also a concept of purity and impurity about food when your food becomes susceptible to impurity, which is also the end of last week's parsha. So in the middle of the book of Leviticus, which you think about it, it's talking about making the temple and becoming close to God and bringing offerings, and everything is so spiritual and everything is so holy. And all of a sudden we end up in the middle of the book and it's like, um, where did all this impurity come from? Why is this interesting? Or it's very negative. And the question is, what is it doing right here? So I always like to think about that when you read about writing, for example. So you say, there's a debate, I think, what's the most powerful part of the sentence or the paragraph or the book? So the most interesting things you put in the middle or at the end. If you have a sentence, the beginning and the end is supposed to be a punch, supposed to be powerful. And the middle, you throw in the technical concepts. Same thing with the paragraph, same thing with the chapter, same thing with the book. So maybe we're middle of the third book. People are already, no one's listening, so we can throw in all the quote unquote boring or quote unquote negative parts of the story. So we're literally in the middle of the Torah and we're talking about all this negativity. But of course, that's only a joke. That's just to get your attention. But really, so we have to figure out all of a sudden, where does all this negativity show up? And there are different ways of thinking about this. But if you want to sort of zoom out and say what's happening here, and what's happening here is as follows. By the way, you're zooming out, but it's also zooming in because a lot of the paradox of unholiness in the Torah is that, I'm sorry, let me take that back. The paradox of ritual impurity in the Torah is that ritual impurity is very much related to holiness. Something that cannot be holy cannot become ritually impure. And the more holy something becomes, the more susceptible it is to impurity. So that's something to keep in mind. We're going to get back to it, but let's talk about the bigger point. What's the bigger point? The bigger point is that we're talking about ever since we left Egypt and we're trying to overcome the sin of the golden calf, and we're building a temple to God. And then we talk about the beginning of the third book. We're talking about the korban, which is not a sacrifice but an offering. We're offering ourselves close to come close to God, and we come close to God. The eighth day we came close to God because God's presence dwelled in the temple. Maybe we came too close to God because the two sons of Aaron come too close, and there's negative ramification because two of the sons of Aaron die. So what happens here? We come close to God. Could we come close to God? Could we come close to God all the time? And here there's a news flash. What's the news flash? The news flash is we're human. Human being is a hybrid between body and soul, between spirit and matter, between unholiness and mundane. So if you're going to say we're only talking about holiness, that means you're not respecting the fact that we are creation, we're human, we have limitations. We can't always stand face to face with God. We have weakness, we have fault, right? And this concept that we are both holy and we're mundane and we have shortcomings and we're creatures of nature, which is the physical world, with everything that comes along with that. That is why there is this tension between holiness and holiness and ritual impurity. And it's almost the other side of the coin because we're a hybrid. And when you have one, you have the other because we're not angels. And that's the whole point. The whole point is we're not angels. If we're angels, in a way, if we're not susceptible to impurity, then the holiness doesn't really mean anything because we're holy because we were created holy and because we have no choice to be unholy, right? But the beauty of the human being is that the human being is hybrid of heaven and earth. So hybrid of the potential for holiness. And together with that, even when I'm becoming holy, there are parts of me that are unholy. And the parts of me that are unholy could become holy, right? It depends. But I can't always become holy. There's going to be a retreat and return. So if we're just talking about angels, there would only be holiness. If we're just talking about souls, there would only be holiness. But we're not just talking about souls. We're talking about the body. And the body is imperfect. And we talk about what unholiness, what ritual impurity means. There are different ways of thinking about this. But what they all have in common is it's related to the body. And in a way related to death or potential for death, the opposite of life. And we're mortal. We're not immortal. So the body is going to be susceptible to impurity. But in a way, the other side of that coin is then the body is susceptible to holiness. Not just is the soul susceptible, holy, soul is for sure holy. But if what becomes impure, ritually impure, because it's physical, it also becomes pure. At moments, you can actually bring the body to the temple. You can actually go into the temple. And that's the beauty here. The beauty here is don't just think about coming close to God with your soul. Don't forget you're a human being and you have a body and you're mortal and you're finite. And therefore there's impurity and you can't always come close to God, but occasionally you can. And not just your soul can always. You can always close your eyes, say Shema, for sure you can always. But even the body could become holy. Even the body can come close to God. But don't forget the body is also earth, so there's also limitation. So this is already a whole other story. It's not boring and negative. It's saying, how do we take the messages of the Torah that we talked about the soul, and how do we get the body along as well? And what happens to me when I have a body? And when I have a body, it means I'm not going to be spiritual all the time. And I'm not going to be joyous all the time. And I may get, I don't want melancholy. And I may have spiritual challenges. And maybe I'm not in the right mood for my body to come to the temple right now. What do I do? How do I deal with that part of reality? And it's not just and again, if you want to go deeper, it's not just a handicap. In a way, that's the whole point. The whole point is that something that is susceptible to impurity could then become pure. And that's the big idea. So in other words, we're talking about holiness for all this time, but we're saying, don't forget about the body. Don't forget about the all parts of the personality, the positive and the negative. And because we are not just souls, we are a hybrid, and that's the whole point of humanity. Therefore, there are going to be elements of, because we're considering the body, there's going to be elements of impurity, and that impurity itself could become pure. So that is, now we have to figure out what is impurity and what is purity. But again, at least we know where we're headed and why this is important, and in a way, why this pops up right now. Because we're coming too close. We say, you know what, I'm human. Could I come close all the way? Could all parts of myself come close? Okay, so then there's already regulation. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Thank you, Rabbi. I guess this part of the Torah, that parsha, is even more multi-layered than others because there is, for one, on one side we have holiness. We can all be holy because of the soul, but on the other hand, it's unholiness, right? It is impurity, and
Right.
to do about it today, but when we all considered ritually impure. So how do we deal with it today?
Right. So I would say that we're all considered ritually impure, but impurity and impurity in ritual purity. Whenever I say purity, I mean ritual purity. So I'll say it once, I don't have to repeat it. But the point is, there's a spectrum. So for example, a person could be ritually different degrees of ritual impurity and purify from some and not purify from others. And everyone has ramification. And it's a complicated subject there. So there's a sixth of the Mishnah, a full sixth of the Mishnah is laws of purity and impurity. But the point is, it's a spectrum. So it's not like we're ritually impure and therefore we can't become pure. We're ritually impure with the purity of because everybody came in contact with a human corpse, or you came in contact with someone who touched a human corpse. So in that sense, there's ritual impurity. But then there's other purities. A person goes to the mikveh, a person could be purified. So there's a spectrum. But the point here is, it's not just, I want to reiterate, it's not just that my soul is pure, my body is impure. No, my body is susceptible to impurity, but that means it's susceptible to purity too and holiness. A stone is not susceptible to impurity and it's not susceptible to purity. It cannot become impure. In fact, if you were ritually impure in the olden days, what you want to do is you want to have, instead of drinking coffee from a cup, which a cup could become impure, you want to drink cup from a stone. You want to drink your coffee from a stone cup because a stone cup doesn't become ritually impure. And then I can hand you my cup. If you're pure and I'm impure, I can hand you my cup because the stone is not susceptible to impurity. And there's all kinds of laws. There's the longest chapter in the Mishnah, Kalim, which is vessels, is 30 chapters about which vessels become pure, which vessels don't become pure. The point is we can keep busy for the long time with this, but the principle is that the body and the physical, the fact that it could become impure means it could become pure. It just means that it's physical. And the physical comes along with shortcomings, and the physical comes along with limitation. And therefore you can't say, I will always be in a situation of full awareness and full spirituality, right? And if you want to think about this concept of two sides of the coin, nowhere is it stronger. I don't know if you want to open this up right now because it may so much to talk about, but nowhere is it stronger where the woman giving birth is ritually pure. She's the greatest act of giving, the spiritual act, the expression of the infinite power to create. When Chava creates, she says, when she has her first son, she says, Kaniti ish im Hashem, I acquired man with God. I partnered with God. I became a creator, right? Because creation is a recipient. To the extent that you receive your creation, to the extent that you create something new, you're a creator. Say just that you're a partner with God in creation. Nowhere is that more clear than with childbirth. But childbirth also comes along with ritual purity. With ritual impurity, we could talk about that. But the reality is childbirth is also painful. And it's also psychologically painful. And it's also, this abrupt change between giving life and then all of a sudden that stops immediately when the child is born. So there's almost like there's a high and there's a crash. And that now we call it postpartum depression. But the point, which is much more common than we thought in the past. But that just becomes because we're doing in other words, the greatest thing that you could do is also going to come along with the greatest potential for the withdrawal of that high afterward and sensing the pain of it all. The whole process is painful because we're human. So is it a happy event or is it a sad event? If you say one or the other, you're in denial of either you're in denial of either the spiritual side or the physical side, right? So maybe that's why we start with a woman giving birth, because that sort of sets the tone of what's happening here. The more joy, the more sadness, potential for sadness. The more holiness, the more potential to impurity, the more potential to purity. But it all becomes from the fact because we're human and we have both of these elements and we're a hybrid. So that is I think a good place to start, the big picture. So again, we're talking about this now because we want to incorporate also the body, and we discover something that some people who are very idealistic don't always know. It may take them a few portions to find out, maybe half their life, maybe midlife crisis, maybe mid-book crisis, maybe Nadav and Avihu crisis. Oh, we have a body. Oh, we're not perfect. Oh, we thought we could invest in spirituality and that will solve all our problems. We're going to have no disappointment in our life because we're so devoted to spirituality. We're going to have no pain in life because we're so devoted to spirituality. I have this thing, okay, I shouldn't say it online, but I'll say it anyway, that in the culture where people have large families, they tell the kids that, oh, it's a great blessing and it's so meaningful and it's so rewarding, and all the above is true. But I think it's a disservice not to say it's difficult and it's a very big sacrifice and it's rewarding, right? But if you say one without the other, it's not the truth. And then people are upset at themselves. Why is this so hard? Someone told me that you should have a large family. It's going to be so enjoyable. How come I'm struggling? How come I'm not happy? Because nobody told you, because no one told you you're also physical, you're also a human being, and you're also a physical person. And the things that give you the greatest joy also give you the greatest grief, namely having children, right? At some point or another. So that's because we're just looking at one element. But here we say the wake-up call. we're more than one element. We have body and soul. We're in the physical world. Everything that the great things that are the most spiritual are also the most difficult and the most painful. And don't ignore that pain. Give it time. There's a time for purity, time for impurity, time for sadness, time for joy. And respect yourself and respect how you feel. And there's nothing wrong with you. And it doesn't mean you're bad. It means to the contrary. It means that you're, even in the moments of impurity, it means that you're susceptible to the greatest holiness. And the more holiness you're susceptible to, the more unholiness you're susceptible to. So this is like I think this is my I think this is an amazing I think this is amazing stuff.
And that includes body and soul because
Yeah. Because the soul is perfect. The soul has no problems. The soul has no problems.
yeah, but it's also susceptible to unholiness because the soul, body and soul are connected. So
Yeah, in a way, it affects the soul, but only to the extent that the soul is invested in the body. Kabbalah talks about that most of the soul is not invested in the body. Most of the soul is hovering above, makif, right? So part of you, part of the soul, it's like you have the conscious personality, the conscious consciousness of the person is the part of the soul that's invested within the body. And in my consciousness, yes, if I hit my toenail on the table, my soul is going to be uncomfortable. I'm not going to be able to think philosophy if I just bang my toenail. But that's only the part of me, that's only the part of my soul that's invested in the body. But then there's the most of it hovers, most of it is makif. And that is less, I'm not going to say it's not affected completely, but it's less affected, right? It's less affected. And you can then go back and find a place within yourself where a lot of this doesn't matter. But part of yourself, but even part of it, it does matter. And that's what we're dealing here with the concept of purity, impurity. And yeah, so that's a little bit about the general concept of where we find ourselves in the book and why we're here right now and why what looks to be technical and boring and uninteresting, all of a sudden, if you look at it from this perspective, all of a sudden, this is very relevant and it's really very important because we want, therefore, the relationship to God to encompass even the imperfect parts of self, namely the physical body, which is mortal and does have limitation and is not going to be and is not always spiritual. So that is by way of introduction. Now, if you want to talk about purity and impurity, you could talk about the idea that we know that it's considered a chok, it's considered a decree. Um, it's one of those laws, as we know, the Torah has that there's three categories of the Torah's laws. There's edut, chukim, mishpatim. Mishpatim is the ordinances, which are logical. We had that in the middle of the second book. And then you have edut, the testimonials, mitzvot that we do to commemorate the past, which is also logical. I mean, I would not come up with a holiday to not eat bread for 8 days. Personally, I wouldn't. 7 days in Israel, 8 days out of Israel. Personally, I would not think of that. But now you explain it to me that this is to commemorate the past. It's not illogical. It's testimonial, right? So that makes sense. But then there are the mitzvot, the chukim, the decrees that make no sense. And generally speaking, all laws of purity and impurity are considered chukim, are considered decrees because it's metaphysical. The impurity is not filth; it's not physical dust and physical dirt that could be removed. And the mikvah is not this it's not a spa, even though we try to market it as a spa, we make it fancy so people should want to come. But that is not the purification properties of the mikvah doesn't come because the water is physically clean. And in the ancient world, before they made modern mikvahs, which figured out how to change the tap water while keeping the rainwater underneath. That's another whole subject. But in the olden days, mikvahs were pretty dirty because it rained in the winter, so you had a natural body of water. But in the middle of the summer in Israel, it wasn't that clean, right? Because the natural body of water, so the point is the whole idea of impurity is metaphysical and the purity is also metaphysical. So it's a decree. So you could say we're just going to follow what the Torah says, and that's why we do it, which is what we do. But Maimonides and others, Maimonides says it most explicitly. He says that even the mitzvot that are chukim, that are decrees, you're supposed to try to understand or learn a lesson or what is the symbolism. Now, it's a decree, so you're not going to say you're not going to speak about this definitively, and this is the only reason. It's sort of beyond the capacity to understand, but could be part of the reason, or this could be a dimension. And that's why there's a genre of trying to explain what this is, what purity represents. And generally speaking, I would say that everybody would agree that purity would be that impurity would be the vacuum of life. So where there was life, and now there's a vacuum of life, that's impurity, and it could be um, philosophical or psychological. What do I mean? So I'm going to try to say a few points that a few people say, but hopefully just this is an example. It's not the only way of thinking about this. So one interpretation is like this. What's the problem with with death? Let's start with death because death is the most severe form of impurity, and in a way, every type of impurity is miniature death. So, or the absence of the potential for life. If there was a potential for life and now it's no longer there, then it's the absence of life. It's the opposite of life. So there's a potential. So in a way, it's death. So there's going to be pure impurity. And usually the greatest degree of impurity is coming in contact with a dead person. That's the most severe in most ways. There's one way with a tzarat is more severe, but that's a technicality. That's specific. We can talk about that later. And what are we talking about? We're talking about the idea that what does death mean? Death means a person comes face to face with their mortality, and that's why death is depressing. Most people don't think about it until they do, and then a person thinks about their mortality, and it could be unsettling to say the least. Now, why is thinking about mortality unsettling, not just psychologically but also spiritually? What's the spiritual danger? And in some ways, the reading is impurity means you're in a spiritually dangerous territory, and therefore make time to try to purify yourself. Now that takes time; it's a process. But in some ways, to read this is spiritual impurity means you're spiritually dangerous territory. So be careful. Proceed with caution. That's what that's what it's telling you here. What is the danger of thinking about mortality? Mortality is something we cannot escape. So we see our limitation and we see that we are subject to laws of nature and we're really slave to the laws of nature and there's nothing we can do about it. Now, what is the danger? The danger is if I apply this to my moral life as well. I say, I'm just a human, just like I can't control my fate. I also cannot control my spiritual fate. In other words, I'm trapped by the laws of nature and I can't overcome them. I can't make myself live forever. But maybe then the application may be that the weakness of the human being, and the weakness would mean I cannot overcome my own instincts. I can't change. I can't grow. This is my nature. Whenever I get into trouble and somebody says, "Why did you do this?" I say, "That's my nature." There's no better answer. What do you do? I should suppress my nature, right? So if I have that attitude, then coming in contact with the weakness of the human body may also affect the person's may be applied to the soul and say the soul is weak and the willpower is weak and the moral life is weak and that's spiritually dangerous. And I can't come to the temple until I am removed from that space and I'm able to go back to living water, which is the symbol of life, and realize we can get into the different symbolism in this week's parsha that we take ashes and we take water. We'll have that with later in the parsha. Then the next book, when we talk about the purification of the person who comes in contact with the dead person, but even in this parsha, purification of the tzarat, there's different elements. But the point here is that I'm trying to say, I just lost my train of thought. I'm trying to say is, yes, the body is limited. The body is under the laws of nature, but the soul is not. And therefore, a person is morally free, even though the person is physically not. And physically, you're under the laws of nature. But coming face to face with that limitation. In other words, anytime a person thinks the human being is weak, that's a spiritual danger. Right? The human strength is also a spiritual strength. That means I can do anything I want. That means I could change. That means I can improve. But if I realize I can improve, I can't, in other words, physically speaking, there are constraints, then maybe there's a limitation to my spiritual capacity. That's spiritually dangerous. So that's one important point. And in general, the idea that the death represents the body because the body is mortal, but the soul is immortal. So now you have but the body, even though the body is mortal, the body also is life producing. So the body does have the capacity to give life. So it's a mix of these two things. And when I connect to the life element, it's ritually pure. When I connect to the weakness element, it's ritually impure. So that's a little bit more philosophically speaking, but I think that's already enough of an introduction. And now we can start going back into the concept of specifically, we have to talk about the Tzarat a little bit because that's what the whole parsha is about. And I have to conclude a few minutes early today, so I apologize in advance, but that gives us about 15 minutes. Okay. Tzarat. Tzarat is, like we said, a person is going to have tzarat on the flesh of their skin, and you bring it to the Kohen. What is tzarat? Nobody knows. The Torah doesn't say where it comes from, where it doesn't come from. People think that the Jews thought that this was just a leprosy and a skin disease, but it really isn't, because in a way it's clear that they understood that this was never to be understood as a physical ailment or physical leprosy, because even what they knew at the time, what we're doing is the opposite. You're supposed to not quarantine. You're supposed to expose it to the sun, to dryness, and here they would quarantine it in a dark and wet place. So in other words, it's not helping in the physical sense, even based on the science they understood then. So the sages say, most of the sages would follow the opinion that tzarat comes from the word Metzora, motzira, taking out bad. The person speaking with the tzarat is exposing bad. And therefore, the sages say that it was a sin for lashon hara, for evil speech, for speaking bad about other people. Even in the Bible, when we get to the fourth book, where Miriam gets leprosy, it's because they're speaking about Moshe or Moshe's wife. And right away, the punishment is tzarat, is leprosy. So whenever you're going to see leprosy in the Bible, it's going to be related to negative speech. So Metzora is expressing negative speech. And if a person expresses negative speech, then in other words, the negativity, it's almost measure for measure. The symbolism is the negativity sort of surfaces to the skin of to the skin, to the surface where everybody can see it, because everybody has some negativity, but sometimes you can hide it. But if it comes to the surface, then it's clear that you're expressing someone else's evil person, that your own evil is also expressed. And then you figure out how to navigate that and how to negate it, how bad it is, how bad is it, etc. But everybody talks about the idea of speech. And in general, in Judaism, speech is understood to be very important and treated with great respect. We talk about the fact that God creates the world with speech, and a person can also create their own environment with speech. And the words you use decide what kind of universe you live in. Words of kindness express kindness, bring out kindness in others. If I tell somebody, you're so kind, that's going to elicit kindness within them. If I tell you you're a horrible person, that's going to bring out the negativity within the person. So the Torah treats the speech with great respect. And in a way, the person who's speaking negatively about other people or slandering other people or negative speech, I said before that in some ways the ritual impurity of the tzarat is the most severe. And that is in the fact that we read it in a nutshell, that the Metzora has to dwell alone outside the camp. And not just the way not just with other people that are impure, they could hang out with other impure people, but the people who are impure, each person has to sit alone. Badad Yeshev will sit alone. And that's very, 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 that is very an indication of great severity, because people need connection, people need social connection. And here, the Metzora is deprived of any connection, even connection to other Mitzoraim, other people with Tzarat. And now the question is, first of all, why are we punishing the person in that way? And a little bit deeper, what is the deeper message here? And how does this apply to us as well? So the first thing is, you could look at it as measure for measure, which is that if you think about the worst thing to the fabric of society is people slandering and gossiping and saying bad things about the other people, because what it does is it creates distrust and it severs the ties of the community. Think about a small shtetl. Everyone's living in the same area. We've been living here for multiple generations. I know your grandmother, you know my grandkids, and we're all living together. And a person says something negative about someone else, all of a sudden that creates distrust, and it creates and that has ramification because in a society what they call low trust societies, then there's plenty of negative ramifications. And societies where people trust each other, they're much more successful. And the point here is if a person is going and speaking about other people and severing ties between communities, then they have to learn to appreciate the value of community. And how do you appreciate the value of community if they're separated from the community and they're not and they don't have the benefits of community? Then they'll realize how painful that is, and they'll learn to respect the community, and that will become the opening for the idea of not speaking and not cutting the ties between community. So that's on a very basic level that this is measure for measure. It's a consequence. If I disconnect people, then I have from within a community, then I'm disconnected from that community. I don't get the benefits of that community. And then when in my time away, time to think about this, I realize how I need the community, and then I appreciate that, and then I can be reintegrated. So that's on a basic level. There's a lot more to say. Hopefully, we'll have time for that. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Oh, thank you, Rabbi. Just a quick question. So Lashon Hara is somebody speaks negatively about somebody else, and it's true. When if somebody speaks negatively about somebody else, and that's untrue, is the severity is different, or is
In
it
a way,
also Lashon Hara?
in a way, it's worse. So generally speaking, it depends how you use lashon hara. In generally speaking, lashon hara literally means evil tongue. It could mean anything. It's the most general term, but there are subcategories, and the subcategories of someone saying something that's not true is called motzi shem ra, slander, giving out a bad name. Even in modern Hebrew, slander, if you want to file a slander case against somebody, it's called motzi shem ra, hotzat shem ra. You're putting out a bad name. But the idea of lashon hara, even if it's true, it's still negative. You still can't do it. But yes, slander is worse than saying something that is true.
But the
But the point,
punishment is the same, right?
yes, when you say tsarat is lashon hara, it means all forms of lashon hara. In fact, like I said, the base of the word Metzora is taking out bad. So you are Metzora, motzira, expressing bad. So that's probably more direct, not in my in my estimation, that's much more directed to the one saying something that is not true, right? Motzira, you're saying something that's bad. So that's what the Metzora is. And then you say, well, other things are also severe. So again, the word Lashon Hara could be both, but I think that the more severe one is expressing someone else's negativity, saying something bad about somebody that is really separating between people and between the community. And therefore, the consequence is that this person cannot benefit from the great gift of social connection. Okay, now we want to get a little bit deeper. And you say a little bit deeper. So this person is going and speaking slander, and the consequence or the rehabilitation, however you want to look at it, is connected to sitting alone. What does that mean? So you want to talk about slander. Okay, so why is somebody speaking negative about somebody else? Maybe they're jealous. Maybe they're jealous. Maybe they're just bad people. Maybe it makes them feel better about themselves. But if you take this person to therapy, probably what a lot of these things have in common is the person has a low sense of esteem of themselves. Because if I have a good sense of self, I don't have to put anyone else down. But if I'm not comfortable with who I am, then, and I see somebody who's getting more attention than me and being more successful than me, so that makes me uncomfortable. So, or someone better than me in certain areas, so I'm going to have to go put them down. In other words, what's really happening here is if I'm speaking bad about other people, it's not that I am seeing negativity in them. It stems from the fact that I don't hold myself in the right estimate. I'm not focused on self. If I focus on myself, I'm not going to have that problem. We could take this in two ways. I'll start with one of them. When a person has to sit alone, what that would do is it takes the focus off other people. So I'm going to start. I'll start with the negative and the positive. I'm in the world. I'm not the person I want to be. I'm not happy with the person I want to be. What's the first? What is one response? One response is to blame the people around me, and doing that is liberating because then I don't have to take responsibility and I don't have to put in the time and effort that it takes to change. because I could just say it's my grandmother's fault and that's it. When I have to sit alone, what that and in fact, what the Torah says is this person has to sit alone, and he would have to say, pronounce himself and say, Tameh, Tameh, I'm impure. Meaning, if someone comes close, it's my responsibility to tell them I'm impure, don't get close. But what is that doing to me? The first step it's doing is saying, take responsibility, understand that the fact that I'm impure is not because someone else is doing something bad or my situation is not great because of somebody else. The starting point is I'm impure. So, in other words, sitting alone makes the person realize that I have to solve my own problems. I can't say it's the other person's fault because now there are no people to blame. So now the fact that I have to change is only in my hands. It's not in anyone else's hands. So that's the first step. The first step is when I sit alone, I realize that when I thought this person's bad and that person's bad and things that are happening to me may be because of what others are doing to me, ultimately it's the personal responsibility. I'm alone. I can fix my situation, but it's up to me and there's no one else to blame. And that's one important step of taking responsibility. But you can also say that in a more positive way. And the positive way is when I'm alone, I am forced to survive on my own. So I have to make myself breakfast and I have to take care of myself. And I realize that I have to depend on myself and I have to find within myself the means for survival. And I have to learn to live with myself. That for a lot of people, it's very hard to, and therefore they're always looking for distraction. And so in other words, the healing process is let the person be by themselves so that they can see the value of the self. In other words, when I'm amongst other people, I'm comparing myself to other people and I'm judging my value based on another person. And that's where, and that's obviously a terrible thing because then if I'm if I'm evaluating myself based on somebody else and I think that person is better than me, I'm going to try to put them down. But my value doesn't come from being, but if I realize my value doesn't come from being better than somebody else, but I have my own unique intrinsic value, then I don't have to slander. Then what caused the evil tongue is going to stop. What's the best way to get me in touch with myself? To put me with myself. And then you learn to accept the self. And learning to accept the self is what's going to lead, therefore, to the healing and to the reintegration. So that is a little bit about what the sitting alone represents as a consequence, but also as rehabilitation. And then I want to conclude with one thing because we have 4 minutes left, but I said this in the past, but it's a beautiful teaching that when it comes to and imagery is beautiful, when it comes to the tzarat of the home, the Torah says, when you will come to the land, and God says, and I will place tzarat in your homes, in the homes of your inheritance. And just this, the word vehaya, which means behold, it will happen. In other words, it's the Talmud says the vehaya is always, vayihi is also always negative, vehaya is always positive. Rashi quotes the Gemara. It sounds like this is something good. This is good news. What's the great news that you're going to have tzarat in your wall, and you may have to, everything will become impure, and you may have to remove some stones from your home, and in radical cases, you have to destroy the whole home. Why is this good news? And Rashi says, well, because Rashi quotes the Medrash, well, because the natives of the land of Israel, they hid their treasures in their walls. Those days it was made of stone, and you had plenty of place to hide. There was no safe deposit boxes. You put everything in your walls. And when the Jewish people came to the land of Israel, they could be living in a spot, and there's a treasure there, but they don't know about the treasure. And when there's a tzarat, and you have to remove the stone, a person could discover the treasure. And that's why on the surface it looks like a negative problem, but deeper there's a hidden treasure. And that's the imagery, that's what the sages say. But if you want to think about this broadly, you could think about this about all types of tzarat and maybe all types of challenge. That when we look at challenge from our perspective, is only the negativity. But the Torah is telling you sometimes the negativity represents, if God placed the negativity in this spot, and sometimes you have to break things down. A person's in a negative relationship, a person is in a negative situation, so something has to break. But sometimes, well, maybe always, but maybe we don't always see it, that the breaking of the negativity or the breaking of the situation because of the negativity, there's also potential for a great treasure that I would not have if I did not have this difficulty. So in other words, difficulty is an invitation to saying that greater potential is available and a treasure is available. And the treasure may be a physical treasure behind the wall, but it also may be a spiritual treasure. It may be something I learned from the experience. It may be becoming a better person. But every situation has its own treasure. But the idea that even if I don't see it, the challenge is actually a treasure behind the wall, that is a very important image. And I think it's a very important lesson for the Tzarat, but perhaps for life in general. So that is scratching the surface of this parsha. Of course, there's so much more to say, but I appreciate everybody joining. Thank you for joining, and have a wonderful day. And we'll see each other in good health, God willing.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.